Okay, so we are going to learn, were the founding fathers really Christian? Which again is such an interesting question because with the rise of Christian nationalism and the religious right gaining more and more power, a lot of the basis for their claims of why this should be a Christian country and why we need more Christians in office and why Christian morals are the best way to go is based on what I think is a false premise that the founding fathers intended this to be a Christian nation. And if we're right about what Britt Hartley is going to say here, my education has told me that they were primarily deists. And the idea of deism is that they believe in a God creator figure, Aristotle's immovable mover, but that this divine being set the universe in motion and then was totally hands-off and does not interact in daily life. That's what deism means. So they still might use the word God, but that in no way is anywhere near the idea of evangelical, like the same alignment with evangelical Christians today by far. So that's my guess of what Britt is going to say. So we're going to take a look.
What would the founding fathers be today religiously, and how Christian really were they? So I'm going to take a break from my nihilism content. I'll be back for more, but I got a ton of requests from people on TikTok to make a longer video on this, and one that's not on TikTok that they could send to maybe some friends and family. So here we go. As far as my qualifications on this, I was a high school history teacher. I taught American history for 5 years. I then went on in my education to study Christian theology and now have a master's degree in theology. So I spent time both in American history and also Christian history and theology to be able to speak about this little sliver here of the overlap between the founding fathers and religious belief, and then talk about how that's being used today. So one myth that we're seeing a lot right now.
Oh my gosh, that was my dog's head. How funny. I really love Britt Hartley's work for so many reasons. I think she's one, just like very, very well educated. Two, I think she's a great woman representative of atheism, again, because she's very well educated. She also calls herself a spiritual atheist, which I really align with and what I had kind of been thinking of calling myself for a long time. And when she's put a voice to that label, that made so much sense to me for a lot of reasons that I actually will be talking about in my next YouTube video on Sunday. But I really like Britt Hartley. She has such an interesting perspective because she doesn't fall into the trap of like just always being rational and always trying to be logical and always trying to, again, like dominate or prove or own Christian theologists, like, which I think is a trap that some, not all, some atheists can really fall into, and just like trying, almost being dogmatic about atheism in return. Like, that's such an easy trap to fall into when you've been dogmatic your entire life. Britt just does a really, really good job of having a balance between rationalism and still being intentional about creating meaning and having fun in life and making sure that we're prioritizing connectivity over our differences. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I like that she always gives her credentials at the beginning of videos too, because one thing about being an atheist content creator is you're going to get a lot of people just say, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, a lot of people will write you off. And so I love that she always is just like, by the way, these are my credentials. Don't fuck with me.
Now is the myth that we are a Christian nation and we need to return to being a Christian nation. If I were to be here like wearing a shirt with all the founding fathers on it and a flag in the background, like unless it's a shirt from the musical Hamilton, you would guess that I'm a flag wearing Christian conservative. So let's tease that out. How did we get here? And so let's do Thomas Jefferson first. I'm going to do 4 or 5 founding fathers here to give you guys a sense of what they actually believed. So first, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and this is a big part of the miscommunication. So right. Deism acknowledges that there may be something like a creator God, but they don't believe in a personal God that interferes with men, that answers prayers, that writes holy books, that does miracles. That would be theism. So deists reject revealed religion, miracles, the authority of religious institutions, the supernatural. And this is a belief system that emerged during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries and was very popular during the time of the founding fathers, especially because of its emphasis on reason. And so the founding fathers were a part of this movement. They thought perhaps there's something like a creator or natural law, and religion can be used in a way to encourage morality in a society, but it's not like capital T true. Like, religions aren't true the way that they're claiming to be true. So like many of the others, Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He heavily criticized organized religion. He rewrote the Bible to remove all of the supernatural elements. Today, he'd be something like a secular humanist. He'd be advocating for science, reason, separation of church and state. So some direct quotes from Jefferson, quote, "Christianity is the most perverted system that ever shone on man." And let's look at Jefferson's Bible. Here it is, cutting out all the supernatural elements. He left a few stories from Jesus, especially some of the ethics of Jesus. And he was sworn in with this kind of secular Bible. The Jefferson Bible is officially titled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, not, Jesus Christ, not Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth. And he did say, like, to give it, to give the Christian right credit here. He did say that the teachings of Jesus are some of the most sublime and benevolent, code of morality that has been ever offered man. So he did see that there was morality that Jesus was trying to teach. He liked the parables of Jesus and how he called out the institution and pointed to a higher morality of the heart. But he wanted to separate what he called the diamonds, Jesus's ethics, from the dunghill, which is the miracles and the dogma and things that he thought were more, mythological and that were added later. And he's right about that. Those things were added later. So he also said that the Christian God is a being of terrible character, cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust. Another little nugget from Jefferson. Quote, and the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by a supreme being as his father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva and the brain of Jupiter.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea. I had no idea that, like, I would stand a founding father so much. I'm going to be honest with you, like, just from my environment and my experience, like, hearing founding father and some guy who wrote the Constitution and founded this country, it has been so easy for me to just write them all off. Like, yeah, some rich guy got power and made a country great, cool. But maybe that's not fair. Maybe this is pretty legit.
Jupiter. So he's seeing Christianity at the same level of Greek mythology. And he is sure that someday in the future, people will look back on Christianity and call it Mesopotamian mythology in the way that we now do the same with Greek mythology and do the same thing with Zeus. And so this requires a little critical thinking here, but what...
By the way, I exclusively refer to the stories in the Bible as Christian mythology. I never call it theology. I mean, I might say Christian theology, but like I try very hard to call it Christian mythology. So just throwing that out there.
What would someone this dedicated to reason over faith, what would he be today if he had access to the science of today? So there's this great story, it's a classic story where during one of his travels, Jefferson was hiking in the mountains of West Virginia and he came across seashells that were high up in the mountain range. And he is just struck by the fact that there's these fossils, marine fossils, that were found so far from the coast at such a great elevation. And to him, this was like mind-blowing, totally inexplicable by just, the conventional science of the time. He couldn't reconcile how seashells had ended up in the mountains. And this discovery left him very perplexed. And he found that the only explanation seemed to be the prevailing worldview with deists, which is maybe just there's a creator God that created the world in this way. But what if he had access to modern science, to geology, to evolution, to plate tectonics and Pangea? Would he really believe in the same God of the gaps that he did in the 1700s when you showed him like how seashells can end up on the tops of mountains? Would he really believe in that same God with the science that we have now? Like, again, like I'm doing requiring some critical thinking here, but I really don't think so. Like, he was a deist for the simple reason that there wasn't enough science yet to explain how a seashell could be so far from the shore. So let's do now James Madison, father of the Constitution. Today, he would either be something like an agnostic or a Unitarian Universalist. So Madison, like the others, very skeptical of organized religion, deeply opposed its influence on the government. His writing suggests that he really values reason and empirical thinking over religious dogma and religious superstition. So if he were alive today, he would be skeptical of organized religion, but he may see its value enough to be part of something like maybe a UU. So he says here, what influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments, churches, had on civil society? In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been the guardians of the liberties of the people, which is true. Like fascism and religion really go hand in hand. During almost 15 centuries, this is his words again, has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial? What have been its fruits? More or less, in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and civility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution, which is still what we see from Christianity today. But he did see that for a young nation, religion could be a tool for unity, especially in a diverse baby of a nation. So he especially saw its value in providing moral education, because at the time, the only way to get something like moral education was through religion. So he saw it as a tool for that. Now let's do George Washington. He's a little bit trickier because he was much more private. Like many of the founding fathers, he used religion as a tool for society. Today, he may be something like spiritual, but not religious. He believed in a higher power, but not religious dogma, not supernatural claims. We know for sure.
I think that that's such a really difficult concept for me that both James Madison and George Washington apparently used religion for the baby of a country. Like that's so difficult for me because I totally see the validity of establishing a religion so that people can have a sense of purpose and a meaning and a way to have community and all of that stuff and extending unity at the very beginning of a country. I get that. But isn't that also indicative of how ingrained the concept of control is in religious establishment? Like, doesn't that specifically say on behalf of James Madison and George Washington that, hey, we're using religion to control you, like, exclusively? Like, that's what that sounds like to me. So I don't know. There's always more to the story. The late Christopher Hitchens is widely regarded as the greatest atheist intellect of his time. Yeah, I love Hitchens. You can't really see it, but I have his anthology right here. Good stuff.
Despite doing things like calls for prayer and fasting, we know he was not an Orthodox Christian. We have records that prove this. So Washington regularly attended services at Christ Church in Philadelphia during his presidency. However, he always left before communion was served. And this was noticed by his pastor, who later confronted him about it. And this is Reverend Abercrombie, is actually his name. And he believed that communion was a duty for Christians. Like, if you are Christian, you need to believe that Jesus died for your sins. So he criticized Washington in a sermon, saying that leaders should set an example by participating in the sacrament. And instead of arguing, Washington just stopped attending church on communion Sundays altogether. He just said, well then, like, if I have to take communion, if I have to believe this, then I'm not going, is basically what he did. And then he told a friend he didn't want to set an example by doing something that he didn't personally believe in. And so all these Christians who point to George Washington as a Christian man, he didn't believe in the atonement so much that he quit going to church because he didn't want to take communion, because we know from that letter to his friend too that he didn't believe it. So Christian nationalists will say here, well, if they didn't believe, why did George Washington, John Adams, even Thomas Jefferson issue proclamations for national prayer or Thanksgiving or fasting, despite their private doubts or their lack of kind of Orthodox Christian belief? And they did so because it's just political tradition that they inherited from England as a way to unify the country. Like, this is a brand new country, and it was customary for European monarchs to declare days of prayer and fasting when you have a crisis and you need the country to be pulling together. So John Adams, even though he was skeptical of religious institutions, he still issued prayer proclamations because he believed that religion kept people moral and obedient to the law, especially in a new nation. So John Adams issued a National Day of Fasting and Prayer in 1798 when we were having some tensions with France, but we know from his letters that he later admitted regretting doing this. He regretted issuing these proclamations of prayer. In writings to his wife Abigail, he said that he had been pressured into doing it politically. So Washington issued a prayer proclamation, but he's very careful to keep it very vague. So he never mentions Jesus. He always uses words like creator or like hand of providence or things like that. So Washington did prayer proclamations, but kept it vague. Adams did it, and we have records showing that he regretted it, and he only did it because he felt political pressure to do so. And by the time we get to Jefferson just does away with it entirely. So Christian nationalists like to pull out quotes from the founding fathers who are using religion for social order or tradition, and then saying we are a Christian nation, when really these are men of reason. They are deists before Darwin, just on pure reason and rationality alone. They used Christianity from time to time politically to help unite the nation, or because they saw value in the moral teachings of Jesus, but across the board, they did not believe in any supernatural elements of Christianity. And they regretted doing those calls to prayer, and eventually that gets phased out entirely. So some Christian nationalists will say, but what about praying at Valley Forge, right? We know this story, but we know that this story is a myth. It sits in my kids' school in the hallway. I look at this painting every time that I go by because it's this great mythical story. So the story typically goes that Washington was kneeling in the snow. He's praying fervently for divine guidance during this harsh winter, 1777, 78, when the Continental Army was suffering from extreme cold, starvation, and disease. And the first known mention of Washington's prayer at Valley Forge comes from Reverend Weems, and he's the same man who created the myth of Washington chopping down the cherry tree, where he says, I cannot tell a lie. So Weems, we know for sure, wrote a highly fictionalized biography about Washington in the early 19th century called The Life of Washington, which was meant to portray him as this model of Christian virtue. But Weems never cites any sources for the Valley Forge prayer story. No contemporary accounts mention it. And this guy had officers and aides that kept detailed letters and journals about.
They are cherry-picking history just like they cherry-pick the Bible. The founders were very clear about keeping religion out of government. And I was literally I was taught that at the private school that I went to, the very Bible-based, far-right, religious, fundamentalist Christian school I went to when I was in elementary school, and these Christian nationalism wasn't even a term. I was taught in that environment that religious freedom was important to the founding fathers. And it's just insane that in such a short amount of time, I'm not that old, that it just got warped into this gross misinterpretation of their original intentions that clearly someone with authority on the subject matter is debunking for us, which is fabulous.
About everything that George Washington is doing, and no one ever mentions him praying. And more than that, we do have record that one time when a preacher tried to get him to kneel in prayer, Washington reportedly stood instead because kneeling for prayer wasn't something he felt comfortable doing. So the history shows he didn't pray, he wouldn't take communion or kneel to pray even when his pastor told him to. He just stopped going to church. And yet Christianity latches on to a myth that perpetuates this narrative that enforces their power and legitimacy, which is something that Christianity is very good at doing, honestly. Another piece that we have to consider is the Treaty of Tripoli, which was signed in 1798. It was started by George Washington. It gets signed in President John Adams' administration. And one of the strongest arguments for the idea that even though the founding fathers were using Christianity for social order, or because most people in this new nation are Christian anyway, they really did not want the United States to be a Christian nation. So the quote is, the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense.
Ooh, I'm screenshotting that.
founded on the Christian religion. So this treaty and the language within it confirms that the United States was intended to be a secular nation, at best a deist nation, but certainly not a theist nation. This was started by George Washington, it was signed by John Adams, and it was ratified unanimously by the U.S. Senate, which contains, most of the founding fathers at that point. So let's keep going through the list. I have to mention Thomas Paine. I think he would be an atheist today because he was like Christopher Hitchens. Like, he was really rough on religion. So his quote says, all national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. He says the Christian religion is a parody on the worship of the sun, where they put in a man who never existed. He said about the Bible, the study of the Bible is the study of words, not of things. It is the study of the history of the world, not of the events of the world. It's just the study of the opinions of some men, not the knowledge of real things. So Paine openly criticized the Bible, the Christianity. He's rejecting the idea of a personal God who interacts with humans. He's rejecting miracles and divine revelation. He's arguing that religion should be based on reason and morality, not superstition and not faith. So to Paine, miracles and faith, these are fabrications. These are designed to manipulate people into belief. So right-wing patriots claim that we're a Christian nation, but here we have Thomas Paine saying, and I quote, "The divinity of Christ is a belief I cannot subscribe to." So at the age of reason, his work was so anti-religion that some of his allies distanced themselves from him because some were saying like, hey, you're going too far, and this is like an attack on the moral fabric of this like young baby republic. So the poor guy goes to France. He spent some time in prison during the French Revolution, and when he returns to the United States, he was largely ignored. People like Thomas Jefferson kind of had some boundaries with him because he was so critical of organized religion, and some people thought even then that he was going too far. So even though he was so influential to the revolution, he died alone with this very tiny funeral. And so there can be a social cost even today for calling out religion. You certainly can't run for office as an atheist, for example, but that social cost was even higher back then. And he paid that cost in order to speak his truth about how much he despised religion and Christianity in particular. So let's do Ben Franklin next. We can't forget him. Like the others, he's a deist. He's a student of the Enlightenment, but saw religion as useful in helping people focus on moral virtues. We have to remember that today my kids go to school, and without the Bible, they have like a virtue of the month. They get praised for expressing good ethics. They have teachers that read them books about being kind. There wasn't anything like that outside of religion at the time. But he does say, I have found Christian dogma not at all to my liking, but I've always thought well of the ethics of the religion. I believe in the same kind of God you do, but I do not find it necessary to belong to any particular church or follow some kind of priesthood to be virtuous. So like the others, he would believe in some kind of, like today, he may be some kind of agnostic, secular humanist, or he may believe in something like a higher power, but he certainly wouldn't go to any kind of Christian church. He certainly wouldn't be a believer in Christianity. So one of the most well-known stories about Franklin is that he was testing religious claims, and the most famous one is the power of prayer. So Franklin was skeptical of the idea that prayer did anything. And so Franklin was when he was a part of the Pennsylvania Assembly, this is in 1749, there was an outbreak of smallpox in that region, and many attributed the cure of the disease to divine intervention through prayer. So Franklin, doing what students of the Enlightenment do, he started to devise experiments where he could propose a study comparing the effectiveness of prayer and medicine in fighting disease. We have many of these studies today, but he had to do them on his own. And his idea was to gather a group of patients, some of whom would be prayed for and others would not, but everyone would receive the same medical treatment. And his goal was to kind of empirically test if prayer had any discernible effect on recovery. And so he eventually wrote a letter to the public arguing that it was nonsense to claim that prayer could cure diseases without any scientific backing. He suggested that maybe prayer provides comfort for people, but it does not have any direct impact on the physical realm. So I'm actually being quite generous in saying today he may be someone who believes in God but doesn't go to church, when really, if you are the type of mind to be running experiments on religion 200 years ago, before it was cool to be an atheist, before we even had studies on religion, it's not a far leap to say that his rational approach would have made him more like an atheist today. But I'll give the other side the benefit of the doubt and say at most he'd be a deist, believing in a creator God and skeptical of any kind of supernatural elements whatsoever. So how did we get here, which is how did we get the Christian right in America to a place where they can claim the founders for their side? Because the preamble of the Constitution does not mention God. It does not establish a religious framework for the country. There's other documents like the Declaration of Independence where there's words like creator or like nature's God, but this is the deistic understanding of God, something that kind of sets the universe in motion, but certainly doesn't intervene with humans. And these references were more about kind of natural law and human rights rather than actual belief in Christianity. But over time, what happened is these references to a deistic God were interpreted selectively to support this narrative that we are a Christian nation, because people don't understand the historical context of the differences between a deist and a theist. So any time in American history where we need some kind of uniting force, you'll see this move to, we are a Christian nation. So in the early 19th century, particularly in the Second Great Awakening, evangelical Christianity was gaining significant influence in the United States. There was this kind of revival of religious fervor. There's lots of new religions like Mormonism, the religion that I was raised in, and many evangelical leaders were pushing for an increased role of Christianity in the public sphere. And so as the country was expanding westward and became more diverse, religious leaders felt the need to reinforce Christian values as a way of uniting the country. And so this movement helped to blur the lines between religion and government. So prominent leaders like Lyman Beecher advocated for Christian morality to be the cornerstone of American law and society, and there were arguments that we are a Christian nation rooted in Christian principles. After the Civil War, same thing. The United States was being ramped up again as a Christian nation because it's a time where we needed unity. Many in the South were devastated by the outcome of the war and began to embrace the idea of the United States as a Christian nation in order to kind of bring back the unity of the United States.
So that's another thing that, because a lot of us are talking about how we can build a like secular society, a humanist society. How can we do that with unity? And that's something that I'm still kind of like trying to formulate and piece together, and maybe even struggling with a bit, because I don't know what that would look like. We don't have a blueprint for it. We have no idea what a non-religious society, not just non-religious, a pluralist, diverse, unified society would look like. We've literally never seen it happen. I mean, China is an atheist country, but it's like a single party state where atheism is like enforced. And that's not, I don't think that's what anyone wants. I think we all want everyone to be able to worship in their own time, in their own communities, in their own families, in their own way, but that the state, the unification of all of us, should not have any dictation on what we do or do not believe or kind of believe or anything, because that is a deeply personal, very often deeply transformative process and part of our inner lives that should have no bearing. The government should have no bearing on that whatsoever. And so this is such an interesting video, because I think, we want to establish this utopia, which is like, is a utopia ever possible? Well, at least something better than what's going on would be nice. And I still don't know what that would look like without religion. How could this country have been founded on Christianity anyway, considering that many of its founders were slave owners who thought that the original people already inhabiting the land were savages needing to be exterminated? Another great point. So much for Christian morals that, by the way, are absolute and never relative. Isn't that interesting that the morality of slavery has changed over time, almost as if it's relative to the evolutionary progress we make as a society? Yeah, I've wondered what it would take to start a new country nowadays. There are some interesting options that are like kind of being circulated, like this idea of network states. I have only done like a small little deep dive into the concept. A lot of them are like really far right leaning in conception. And so that's not really comforting, to say the least. But yeah, I don't know. But I do think that, and I talk about this so much, but I so mean it, like so many of these institutions just aren't serving their original purpose as well anymore. And we have all of this capability. With 8 billion people, technology that connects us better than ever, like we have all of this capability for something better than bullies in the United States government trying to dominate people in the Middle East. Like, so I mean, that's just my take though. Who knows?
The Christian worldview provided a way to kind of reconcile the trauma of war and slavery and try to help national healing. And then when we need unity again with the communists, we start adding things like under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. So the inclusion of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance and in God we trust on our money in the 1950s was because we were trying to distinguish the United States as being a Christian nation from godless communism. So again, we're just using Christianity politically when we want to, how we want to. So this shows how Christian nationalism has evolved, and it's often manipulating the past to create this religious image of America when we need a uniting force, when we need Christianity for those political means. So the idea that the U.S. is a Christian nation, it really took off in the 20th century, especially with the rise of conservative Christianity in the 50s and 60s. So we have groups like the Moral Majority and the Christian Right that are now pushing for policies that focus on Christian goals. So politicians, including Ronald Reagan, would start using, religious language to connect with voters and strengthen their political power. And then over time, Christian nationalism became kind of merged with the idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that America had a special role in God's plan and that we were special to God to spread freedom and democracy and Christianity all around the world. So in the late 1800s and 1900s, people were rewriting history to make it seem like the U.S. was always meant to be a Christian country. They ignored all the secular ideas that the founding fathers held, like those of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Thomas Paine, who were critical of organized religion and believed in keeping church and state separate. And instead, people started to focus on the fact that many of the founding fathers would participate in Christianity, even if it was in a non-traditional way, and they would argue that therefore the U.S. is a Christian nation. So today, the myth that the U.S. is a Christian nation is really held up by a couple of things. So there's nothing more powerful than when your religion tells you you can't be a Democrat and be a Christian. Like that is power. And so this myth that we are a Christian nation persists now because one, lack of education, people not knowing the differences between theism and deism. Two, politics being able to like throw a crumb at Christianity at any time and just get a ton of votes. Christianity just being the dominant religion in the US anyway, so it's hard to kind of separate it out from our national identity. And then some people continuing to reinterpret history in ways that support the idea of a Christian nation, leading to misunderstandings about the founding fathers' intentions. Now, you can make an argument, just to be fair, I want to be fair here, you can make an argument that the founding fathers would have wanted a more limited government and would be shocked at the overreach of today's government, but that is a separate argument, and you could for sure make a strong case for that. You could make a case that the views of limited government, especially coming from monarchy, would mean that today maybe they would lean conservative as far as size of the government or even libertarian. I don't think that argument is that easy, but just for the sake of argument, I'll give that to the Christian right. But you cannot say that the founding fathers would have supported someone like Trump, that they would have wanted.
According to Perplexity AI, the concept of network states revolves around the idea of creating sovereign entities rooted in highly aligned online communities rather than traditional geographic boundaries. These communities are characterized by shared values, goals, and a capacity for collective action. So, okay. Yeah. There is a video that I will try and find, and we can dive into network states, but I warn you, it's kind of intense, and it's also, like, very scary. And when I first came across this concept, it felt a little bit conspiracy theory in nature, but okay, let's wrap up this video. I want to see her final points, and then I will try and we can dive into network states because it's a really, really interesting concept, but the way that we're going about it might be very much very fucked. So let's finish this video, and then we'll do network states. Oh my goddess.
Wanted a Christian nation, that they would have supported Christian nationalism, or that they were Christian. They were not Christian. And I believe they would be genuinely confused as to why believing Christians would have such a hard-on for the founding fathers when the founding fathers would have called out all of their religiosity as superstitious bullshit. Like they would have called all of that out. And so not to mention, a president saying something like, he who saves this country does not violate any law. They would have had something to say about that. Or a president holding the Bible for a photo op and Christianity just like fawning all over themselves. They would have called that out because they did then too. So this is not in any way to say that like I am in the cult of the left and so I just have a bias to make it this way. In many ways, I call out the left that has gone insane in various fields. There are times that I voted red. I live in Idaho, which is a libertarian red state. There's some pros to that approach. So I'm not saying this because I'm a straight ticket voter. I'm not saying this because I only listen to left-wing propaganda. I'm saying this as a teacher of American history and a scholar of Christian theology, that these men would not be Christian today and would not want anything like a Christian nation. So when someone says to me, where's your patriotism? Like, my patriotism is not listening to country music with a beer and watching fireworks with a show that includes Christianity and nationalism. Like, in Idaho, every year for 4th of July, there's a show called God and Country, and it's very much like that. Like, no, that isn't how I show my patriotism or my, gratitude for living in America, because that's not what the founding fathers were advocating for. And then people will also say to me, like, you have a degree in Christian theology, why aren't you Christian? When you spent all of this time in Christianity, why aren't you a Christian? And my answer is that I approach the Bible the same way Thomas Jefferson did. I take the good parts and I cut out the dogma and superstitious and immoral, and I support reason over faith, just like they did. And the way I'm Christian now is far closer to who I think historical Jesus was. Today.
Yeah. Funny thing is, most of the Christian nationalist MAGA don't even know that Trump's daughter converted to Judaism. I didn't know that either, but my assumption is that they probably don't care because Christian nationalism is not about faith. It's not even about unity. It's about power. It's about power over other people. And at first it will be a Christian power over non-Christians, and then eventually it will be about the people on top over having power over even Christians, which is why it's so important to kind of advocate against this issue. And I really appreciate Britt kind of diving into the actual history, the actual stories of the founding fathers, and whether or not they would have been Christian. Because, yeah, she's right. Like, the founding myth and assuming or making the false claim that this was intended to be a Christian nation has unfortunately garnered so much support that this myth is almost becoming reality for so many people. And yeah, I agree. It was very good.